The auction hall's laughter asterisk, the lights inside the alien auction hall flickered and buzzed as the crowd gathered in rows of metal benches waiting for the next item to come out. The smell of chemicals and sweat hung heavy in the air. Alien merchants whispered prices while some wore masks that filtered out the dust. A tall female figure stood behind the curtain, shaking slightly. She heard the laughter already rising before she stepped onto the platform. Her name was Virelia. She was not like the others, taller than most males in the galaxy, with strong limbs and wide hips that looked more like a warrior than a breeder. Her long white hair was braided neatly, and her skin had a soft shimmer like pearl. Her yellow eyes blinked nervously. As the announcer called her name, the curtain opened, and the lights hit her body. Silence came first. Then loud laughter exploded from the crowd. One trader shouted, "She looked like a broken tower." Another said she would crush any male who tried to mate her. The announcer tried to calm the room and read from his datapad. He said she was a rare specimen made by the Harka Gen Labs, built for beauty and reproduction. But the experiment failed because she grew too tall and too strong. Nobody wanted her, not even for labor. Too soft for war and too big for Tuch. Virelia looked down at her bare feet. She remembered when the scientists used to praise her beauty before they called her a waste. Her hands trembled as a chain was clipped to her wrist. The price on her name dropped lower. Every second a group of alien men in cloaks laughed again. One of them offered 5 credits. Another waved his hand and said throw her in the junkyards. The announcer looked desperate and begged the crowd to consider her rare genetics. Still no hands rose. Virelia felt her legs weaken, and then a single voice spoke from the back, "I'll take her." The crowd turned. A human man stepped forward. His clothes were dusty, his boots worn, but his eyes were steady, and his hand raised without fear. His name was Mason. He came from Earth but lived alone on the outer rim now. He wasn't rich and he wasn't powerful. But when he saw the tall alien girl standing under the bright lights trying not to cry, something in his chest moved. The alien traders whispered again, "Why would a human buy a failed breeder?" Some laughed, some glared. But the auction master didn't care. He slammed the gavel and shouted, "Sold." Virelia looked up slowly. Her chain was unhooked. She was told to walk down the steps and follow her new owner. She didn't know what to expect. She had seen males before, some cruel, some cold, most only interested in her body. But this human man didn't stare at her the way others did. He handed her a soft cloth, told her to cover up from the cold, and led her outside without saying a word more. They walked through the alley behind the auction house. Night was falling, and the wind was sharp. Virelia stayed close, still silent, still unsure. After some time, she asked in a low voice, "Why did you buy me?" Mason looked at her for a moment. "You looked like you needed help." That answer made her pause. She had never heard that before. Not from any male, not from any being. Help was not something she expected. Not with her broken history and rejected body. They reached a small transport ship. It was old but clean. He opened the door and let her sit in the back, then started the engine. They flew across the dark sky, leaving the city of traders behind. Virelia looked out the window. She saw stars blink in the sky and felt her chest rise and fall with something strange. Was it hope? She didn't know. She held the soft cloth close to her chest and looked at Mason again. He was not young, not big, not wealthy, but he looked at her like she was not a thing, like she was a person. When they landed on a rocky hill surrounded by trees, she followed him to a small cabin. Lights glowed warm inside. A fire burned in a metal stove. It smelled like herbs and clean air. He pointed to a corner and said she could rest there. She sat down carefully, still watching him, still wondering. Handed her food, warm, simple. She took one bite and closed her eyes. It was the first warm thing she had in years. Later that night, as Mason worked on something near the stove, Virelia looked at him and spoke softly. "Thank you." He didn't reply, just nodded once and smiled, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a mistake. Asterisk. The sky turned purple as the suns dipped. Below the hills, the cabin stood quiet on the ridge. A Few birds flew past and the wind whispered through the trees inside the cabin. Virelia sat still on the floor, holding the warm cloth close to her chest. Mason moved slowly around the space, placing supplies on the shelf, fixing a broken hinge on the door, then pouring water into a metal pot. He didn't say much. Virelia watched him with careful eyes, trying to understand him. She expected orders or commands or maybe even cold silence, but he only worked and let her be. She noticed his tools were old but clean. His hands were rough but steady. He moved with the rhythm of someone used to building and fixing, not destroying. Virelia stood up and tried to walk quietly across the wooden floor. The boards creaked under her weight. She winced and looked at him, thinking he might get angry. He glanced at her and gave a nod, then went back to stirring the water. She found a seat near the stove. Warmth touched her skin, and for the first time she let her shoulders relax. The silence felt peaceful, not tense, like he didn't need to fill the space with words. After a while he placed a bowl in front of her. She looked down and saw small pieces of root vegetables and grains. She hesitated, but the smell pulled her in. She lifted the bowl slowly and began to eat. Every bite was simple but comforting. It reminded her of something she couldn't name. When the food was done, Mason stood up and walked toward the other side of the cabin. He pulled out an old folded blanket and placed it on a bench near the fire. "You can sleep there for now," he said without turning around. Then he walked to his own corner, rolled out a thin mat, and laid down with his arm under his head. Virelia stayed awake for some time. She watched the fire. She listened to the soft hum of wind outside. Her eyes moved to Mason. He had already fallen asleep, breathing slow and calm. She didn't understand him. Why would a human man bring her here? She had no value, no power, no beauty by galactic standards. She was too tall for breeding, too strong for comfort, and too quiet for entertainment. She stood and walked to the small window. Outside, the trees swayed in the wind. She saw stars above the hill. One shot across the sky like a silver blade. She remembered the labs, the cold floors, the sharp lights, the cruel voices calling her defective. Now she stood in a warm cabin with a man who said nothing about her flaws. The next morning Mason found her already awake, sitting outside the cabin watching the trees. He gave her a small nod, then sat beside her with 2 metal cups in his hands. He offered her one. The drink was hot and bitter, but it warmed her chest. "You can stay here if you want," he said after a while. She looked at him, her voice soft. "You're not afraid of me?" He smiled faintly. "You haven't done anything to fear." She looked down at her large hands resting on her knees. "Others say I'm dangerous or useless or both." Mason sipped from his cup. "They say many things when they don't understand something." A breeze touched her face and moved strands of her white hair. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself breathe. No orders, no walls, no pain that evening. She helped him stack wood. Her strength made the work easy. He didn't make her feel strange for it. He only passed her logs and said thanks each time. They didn't talk much, but each quiet moment built something between them. On the third night, a knock came at the door. Mason opened it and found a local trader holding a package. He handed it over and gave Mason a long look, then turned his eyes to Virelia standing behind. "Mason, that yours?" the trader asked. Mason didn't answer right away, just nodded once. The trader shook his head and walked away. Virelia watched him go, then looked at Mason. "You didn't deny me." Mason turned and closed the door. "You are here, that's enough." That night, as the wind picked up and leaves flew against the window, Virelia pulled the blanket around her shoulders. She laid on the bench but didn't sleep right away. She stared at the fire, remembering his words. No one had ever claimed her before. No one ever looked at her and said she was enough. In the silence of the cabin, she whispered something to herself, a word she never used before, home, and slowly her eyes closed as the fire danced in the corner, and Mason's calm breathing filled the room like music. The rain had stopped, but the ground outside the cabin still held the wet smell of fresh earth. Mason stood on the porch, holding a crate of parts he had picked up from a nearby market. Behind him, Virelia stepped out slowly, her long legs moving with careful grace. She wore a robe he gave her last night. It was plain and a little short for her height, but she tied it tight around her waist and folded the collar. Neatly, Mason turned and froze. For a moment he forgot to breathe. The sunlight came through the trees and landed across her skin like golden ribbons. She looked taller than the doorframe, stronger than the cabin walls, but her face held a quiet softness. She looked at him with those glowing yellow eyes and waited, not proud, not shy, just still. He blinked and turned back to the crate. "Ready to head into town?" he asked. She nodded. They walked side by side down the rocky path. Birds chirped above, leaves danced around their boots. As they reached the village edge, people began to notice. A child pointed and asked something. His mother pulled him back. An old trader narrowed his eyes and crossed the street. Two young men stared openly. One even laughed at Virelia's shoulders tightened. Her steps slowed. She looked down at the ground. Mason stopped and looked back at her. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded once. "I'm used to it," she said. But she wasn't used to walking in public with someone beside her. She wasn't used to a man stopping and turning around to check on her, to make sure she was all right. They reached the supply stall. The old woman behind the table recognized Mason and smiled. Then she saw Virelia and her smile faded. "She with you?" she asked. Mason nodded and picked up a bag of grain. The woman leaned forward and whispered, "Best not let that thing near children." Virelia heard every word. Her heart sank again, but she didn't move. She stood still and waited as Mason finished the trade. They left the stall and walked toward the far end of the market. A tailor shop stood near the corner, its windows full of robes and dresses in soft colors. Mason stepped inside and asked the woman at the counter if she had anything long enough for someone tall. The woman looked at Virelia, her mouth open, but no words came. Then she walked into the back. She returned with a folded bundle and handed it to Mason. He paid without speaking, and they left. Back at the cabin, Virelia stood in front of a mirror holding the dress in her hands. It was simple dark blue with thin straps and loose fabric. She took off the old robe and slipped into the dress slowly. When she stepped outside, Mason was chopping wood. The sound of the axe stopped when he looked up. His breath caught again. She stood under the open sky, her white hair falling past her shoulders. The dress moved gently with the breeze. Her arms were strong, her legs firm, but her face was calm like water after a storm. She looked at him, unsure. "Does it fit?" she asked. He nodded. "Better than anything I've seen." She smiled a little, not wide, just enough to make her eyes shine. That night they sat on the porch. The stars came out slowly. She watched them in silence. Mason sat beside her, arms resting on his knees. She turned her head. "Can I ask something?" He nodded. "Why did you really take me from the auction?" He stayed quiet for a moment, then answered, "Because no one else looked at you the way I did." She tilted her head. "And how did you look at me? Like someone who deserved more?" She looked back at the sky. For a long time she said nothing. Then her voice came soft and low. "I was made in a lab, built for pleasure and birth, then rejected for being too tall. They said I was too much, too heavy, too strong, too different. No one ever asked me what I wanted. No one ever thought I had dreams or thoughts. But I did. I always did." She turned to him. "And now you're here, and I don't know what this is, but I don't want to run anymore." Mason reached into his pocket and pulled out a small carved token. He placed it in her hand. It was shaped like a flame with tiny lines cut across its center. "Where I come from, this means belonging," he said. She held the token and felt something stir inside her chest. It wasn't fear, it wasn't doubt. It was a kind of warmth that made her close her eyes and breathe deeper. And as the wind moved through the trees and the stars watched from above, Virelia stayed seated beside him, not as a shadow, not as a mistake, but as someone real. Rain tapped lightly against the wooden roof as Mason tightened the bolts on a broken water pipe near the back of the cabin. The evening air was cool and smelled of wet soil and pine. Inside the cabin, a small fire glowed in the corner, but Virelia was not near it. She stood by the window, her fingers resting on the glass, her eyes watching the dark. Clouds float above the trees. Mason called out, asking if she had seen the wrench. She didn't answer. She had been quiet all day. He stood up, wiped his hands, and walked back inside. He saw her there, still as stone. He paused, not wanting to startle her. "You all right?" he asked. She turned her head slowly, her voice low and calm. "Can we sit?" On the roof, he blinked once, then nodded. They both climbed the ladder that leaned against the side wall. The roof was wide, flat, and made of strong old steel sheets. They sat side by side, their knees pulled up and their hands resting on them above. Then the clouds broke just enough to show the stars blinking quietly. For a while no one spoke. Then Varelia broke the silence. "I have stayed quiet because I thought maybe silence would make me small. Maybe if I didn't speak too much, I would not take up space. Maybe if I looked down, no one would hate me. But I was wrong." Mason didn't say anything yet. She continued, "They built me to please, but I never even got the chance. They touched me and tested me, but never cared what I thought. They told me I would belong to someone great, someone who would choose me. But when I became too tall, too wide, too real, they locked me away and said I was broken." The words spilled out one by one, like a river breaking its dam. Mason listened, his eyes stayed on the sky, but his attention never left her. "I don't know what you see when you look at me. I don't know why you gave me food and clothes and this roof. But I need to know, I need to hear it from you. Why me? Why keep me here? Why protect me when others laugh, when others whisper, when others stare?" Her voice cracked at the end, but she held herself firm. No tears fell, not tonight. Mason turned his head slowly. "I see someone who never got a real chance. I see someone who was punished for growing different. I see strength, not just in your arms, but in how you wake up every day and still walk forward." She looked at him. The glow in her eyes was brighter than ever. "I don't want to be just safe, I want to be chosen," she said. "Not for my body, not for my parts, but for me." Mason took a slow breath. He leaned forward just slightly. "I already did. From the moment I saw you looking down on that stage, from the moment I saw everyone else look away, and you still stood there, I chose you." Varelia's chest rose with a breath that felt like it came from deep inside her. Her shoulders loosened, her fingers curled into the edge of her robe. And then something strange and new lit up her face, a smile, real, not forced, not nervous, just warm. She looked back up at the stars. The silence returned, but it was a different silence now. Not empty, not afraid, but full. Like music without sound. They stayed there for what felt like hours, no need to speak, no need to move. World below kept turning. The night kept breathing. But on that roof, two lives began to shift. No longer separate, no longer unsure later. When they climbed down, she stopped at the ladder and turned to him. "If I stay, I want to help, not just be protected. Not just be hidden. I want to stand beside you, not behind you." Mason nodded. "That's all I ever wanted." She stepped onto the ground with steady feet. The wind touched her hair and carried the scent of coming change inside the cabin. She picked up the blanket from the bench. She folded it carefully and placed it in the chest. Then she walked to the corner where Mason kept tools and asked which ones needed fixing. His eyes widened just a little. Then he handed her a broken light panel as she sat on the floor and opened the panel with gentle hands. He watched her in silence. This time he was the one smiling, and for the first time since the stars were born, the tall alien girl who had once been mocked now felt like she belonged. The sky turned orange as the last light of day slipped behind the mountains. Mason stood by the window tightening a rusted hinge while Varelia chopped wood near the edge of the forest. The cold was coming early this year, and they needed to prepare. Each swing of her axe sent a loud thud through the clearing. Her strength was unmatched, but her face stayed calm and quiet. Mason smiled as he watched her work. She had changed, no longer afraid to move, no longer hiding her height. She stood proud and steady like a tree that would not bend. But peace never lasted long in places like this. That night, as they sat by the fire sharing a bowl of soup, something snapped in the distance. Varelia paused, her head tilted, her ears twitched. Then came the sound of boots on gravel. Mason stood quickly. He grabbed the old rifle from behind the door and stepped outside. Varelia followed close, her eyes glowing with alertness. 3, Shadows moved near the edge of the trees. Tall, cloaked, armed a voice called. Out returned the girl, and we will not harm you. Mason raised his rifle. She's not yours. Another voice laughed. She was made in our labs. She carries the code of our house. She is not a citizen. She is property, and she has something we want. Varelia felt her blood run cold. She knew what they meant. Not her body, not her mind, but her womb, her ability to carry what they failed to create. She stepped forward. No, you left me to rot. You don't get to claim me now. One of the men raised a weapon. A glowing whip made of energy sparked to life in his hand. He cracked it against the ground. You can come quietly, or we will take you in pieces. Mason moved in front of her, his voice low. If you touch her, you'll have to go through me. They laughed again. A warning came. One more step, and we opened fire. Then they stepped. Mason shot first. The blast hit one in the shoulder. The second one fired back. The cabin wall exploded. Wood flew. Smoke rose. Varelia grabbed Mason and pulled him behind cover. Her heart pounded. Her eyes narrowed. Then she moved faster than the wind. She leapt over the railing. Her feet slammed into the ground. The enemy raised their weapons again, but they were too late. She charged. One tried to swing the whip, but she caught his arm and snapped it with a twist. The other fired. The beam grazed her leg. She didn't stop. She slammed her fist into his chest. He flew back and hit the tree hard. The last one tried to run. Mason stepped forward and knocked him down with the butt of his rifle. When it was over, silence returned. Only the crackling fire and the sound of Varelia's heavy breath remained. She stood with blood on her hands and smoke in her hair, her chest rising and falling. Mason ran to her and checked her leg. The burn was shallow. She winced but stayed upright. He looked at her and spoke gently. You all right? She nodded. I'm fine, but they'll come again. More will follow. They know now. Mason looked toward the dark woods, his jaw tight. We'll leave. We'll find a place far from their reach. She looked at him, her voice calm but firm. Even if we run, they'll keep coming until they take what they want. Unless we show them they can't. Mason touched her hand. It was warm and shaking. He didn't say anything. He just held it. Later that night, Varelia stood near the mirror in the cabin. She removed her dress and looked at the bruises. She touched the burn, then looked at her own reflection. Not a machine, not a mistake, not a tool. She saw a fighter, a protector, a woman she stepped out and found. Mason sitting at the table with maps spread around. He looked up. Do you still want to stay with me? Even now. She walked over, placed her hand on the table. Not only do I want to stay, I want to live, really live with you. Not as someone hidden, but as someone loved. Mason looked into her eyes. There was no fear, no doubt, only fire. He reached out and pulled her close. His arms wrapped around her. Her head rested against his shoulder. Outside, the wind howled, the trees shook. But inside that small cabin, two hearts beat as one. The war was coming, but they were ready together. Morning came with golden light spilling across the hills. The sky was clear, but the air held a chill. Mason stepped outside carrying a small bag. Varelia followed with a scarf wrapped around her shoulders, hiding the faint burn on her leg. They had packed quickly after the attack. It was no longer safe in the cabin. Too many eyes knew where she was. They took the transport and flew low under the clouds. Their destination was an old station hidden inside the cliffs, an outpost from the old wars, now used by healers and travelers. Mason knew someone there, a doctor, one of the few who treated both humans and aliens without asking questions. They landed near the outpost and stepped out onto the stone path. The entrance was carved into the rock. A steel door opened with a slow hiss. A short man with silver skin and red eyes stepped forward. Mason, you finally visit, and with a guest I see. Mason nodded. We need your help. She needs answers. The doctor looked at Varelia and raised a brow. Come in. Let us see what truth hides in the blood. Inside, the walls were lined with old machines and glowing panels. Varelia sat on the exam bed while the doctor connected wires to her arms and back. She stayed still, but her heart raced. The doctor tapped on a screen and frowned. He checked again, then again. His hands moved Faster now, his eyes wider. Mason stepped closer. What is it? Tell me. The doctor turned slowly, his voice almost a whisper. She is pregnant. Varelia blinked, her lips parted, but no words came. Mason stood frozen. That is not possible, she said. My kind, we were not made to carry, only to serve, only to obey. They said we were not complete. They said we could never make life. The doctor stepped forward and showed the screen. The image was clear, a small bright pulse, a new life, real and strong. This is no error. This child is forming well, and the energy signature, it is mixed, part human, part her kind. I have never seen this before. Mason looked at Varelia. She sat still, her hands shaking, her eyes full of storm and sunlight. Did not know I felt different, but I thought it was stress, fear, hunger, not this. Mason reached for her hand. She held it tight. You made something they never could, he said. You are not broken. You are powerful. You are more than they ever imagined. Tears formed in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Instead, she stood, her back straight, her voice strong. If they find out, they will come harder. They will not stop. They will want the child. They will want me as a vessel, not as a woman, not as a mother, but as a thing. Mason looked at the doctor. Can you hide her? Can you shield the signals, at least for a while? The doctor nodded. I can cloak the readings. I can give you time, but not forever. Varelia turned to Mason. We need to go somewhere they cannot follow, somewhere forgotten, somewhere no one dares to look. Mason opened the map. His finger landed on a red zone. An old mining moon, no longer active, no records in recent systems. We go there, he said. She nodded. Before they left, the doctor handed her a small pendant. This will hide your body's changes from scanners. It will not stop those who see with eyes, but it will confuse the machines. She took it and wore it around her neck. The metal was warm and pulsed with a soft hum. They left the outpost before sunset. The ship rose into the sky and vanished among the clouds inside. The ship. Varelia sat near the window. She placed her hand on her belly. No bump, yet no movement, but she felt it, a spark, a beat. A bond. Mason sat beside her. He looked at her and spoke gently. You have given me something I never thought I would have again: hope, family, future. She leaned her head on his shoulder. I did not know how to be a mother. I was never shown love. I was never taught care. But I will protect this child with all that I am. He kissed her forehead. Then you already are a mother. The stars stretched across the sky outside the window. Far away, the syndicate stirred news would reach them soon. The hunters would return. But now Mason and Varelia had something worth everything. They had life, and they had each other. The mining moon had no name. It floated near the edge of an old asteroid belt covered in dust and forgotten machines. Mason landed the ship on a flat surface near a collapsed tunnel. Varelia stepped out and looked around. The air was thin but clean. The sky above was dark blue with faint stars blinking beyond the clouds of iron gas. They moved quickly. Mason carried supplies while Varelia explored the broken structures. Her steps echoed on the metal floors. Each corridor told stories of workers long gone. No cameras, no scanners, no life but their own inside a small room with thick walls and working lights. They made a home. Old beds, old wires, but it was warm. Safe still. Varelia stood near a mirror made of scrap metal. Her hands rested on her belly. It had started to grow, only a little, but enough to see. Mason walked up behind her and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. He rested his chin near her neck and spoke gently. 2 weeks and no sign of trouble. Maybe they gave up. She shook her head. They will not stop. They believe I belong to them. They think our child is theirs. They think I was made for use, not for love. Mason held her tighter. Then they can try, but they will never take you, never touch our child. That night, they sat outside the door. The wind was quiet. The stars closer now. Varelia placed her hand in his and whispered something he had never heard from her. Before you, I did not believe I had a soul, only function, only design. Now I feel warmth when I see your face. Now I feel purpose when I hear our baby move. I was not made, I was born. The moment you looked at me like I mattered. Mason looked at her and smiled. I didn't save you, you saved me too. Just as the words left his lips, a soft alarm sounded on the ship. Mason stood fast. He checked the screen and saw a signal moving fast, not from space, from the moon itself. They found us. Someone sent a tracker through the black market. They're here. Varelia stood and walked toward the tunnel, her eyes steady, her breath deep. She picked up a long pipe and turned to Mason. If I run, they will chase me. If I hide, they will search forever. But if I face them, they will see who I really am. Mason handed her a pulse shield. We do this together, side by side. No more fear. Moments later, a large ship landed near the ridge. 3 armored men stepped out, blasters ready, eyes glowing red behind their helmets. They spoke through a voice amp. Turn over the asset. She belongs to the House of Vareth. The child inside her is property of the Syndicate. Varelia stepped into view. She raised her voice. Tell your masters. Their claim means nothing here. I am not a product. I am not an object. I am a mother. I am a warrior. And I will not kneel. The leader laughed and raised his weapon before he could fire. Mason hit the ground first and fired a flash grenade. Light filled the sky. Varelia charged through the smoke. Her body slammed into the nearest soldier. The others fired but missed. Mason moved like wind, covering her side. It was not just a fight. It was a storm. Varelia tore the armor from the second soldier and threw him down the slope. The third tried to retreat, but Mason blocked his path and struck with a pipe. When the smoke cleared, only Mason and Varelia stood, breathing hard, holding each other. The ship that brought the soldiers now burned. Sparks flew. No more signals, no more trackers. Varelia dropped her weapon and looked at her shaking hands. Not from fear, from release. She turned to Mason, tears now flowing without shame. I was called a mistake. I was called useless, but now I carry a future, one they never saw coming, one they cannot take. Mason wiped her tears and kissed her forehead. Our child will grow free. Our child will know love. Because you chose to fight, because you chose to live. They walked back to the tunnel, hand in hand, heart to heart. Weeks passed, the world stayed quiet, and one morning as the sun rose over the ridge, soft cry filled the air inside the cabin. Mason held a small wrapped bundle. Varelia reached for the child and held it closer. Skin glowed, her heart raced, but this time not from fear. She looked at Mason and whispered, we did not just survive, we began something new. He nodded and placed his hand on hers. She will never be alone. Not as long as we breathe. And as the stars watched from above and the past crumbled in silence, a new life began. Born not from design, but from love.